You used to feel close to God. You prayed, you sang, you cried. There was a time when every word you spoke in your faith felt alive, like it came from a place of truth. But somewhere along the way, it all started to feel rehearsed, forced, almost like you were acting. And now, you can't tell if you're still praying to connect, or just trying not to be the one who gave up. What's terrifying is not that your faith has changed, it's that you have. And you don't know if anyone would love the version of you that no longer feels like performing. That pain you're carrying, it's not faithlessness, it's fatigue. And not just physical fatigue, it's soul fatigue. The kind that builds up when you spend years trying to hold a spiritual posture that's no longer yours. When you're known for being the strong one, the stable one, the one who doesn't falter, the leader, the example, the person people go to when they lose faith. And somewhere in all of that, you became trapped in the applause. It's subtle at first. People affirm your strength, your wisdom, your discipline. They admire how consistent you are. They praise your walk with God. And something inside you starts depending on that praise. It becomes a part of your identity. But it's not real intimacy with God. It's maintenance of an image. You wake up, read the Bible, post the verse. You pray with people. You show up on Sunday. You smile when you're not okay, and the applause keeps coming until it doesn't. Or worse, until it no longer works. Because eventually, the version of you that people praise begins to feel like a lie, and every compliment becomes a burden. Every expectation feels like a chain, but you don't stop. Because what happens if you do? What happens if you say you're not okay, that you're confused, that you're tired of pretending? You imagine the disappointment in their eyes. You imagine the silence, the gossip, the rejection. So you keep the mask on, and you keep calling it faith. But deep down, you know what it is. It's survival. You're not thriving spiritually. You're just surviving emotionally. And you're surviving by performing the version of yourself that you think God and everyone else still wants to see. This is what no one tells you. You can be burning out spiritually while doing all the right thing. You can be emotionally collapsing while sounding holy. You can be losing yourself completely while quoting scripture fluently. Because there's a difference between living by faith and performing for approval. And that difference is suffocating you. Your heart longs for something raw, something real. But every time you try to get close to it, the character steps in. The one you built over years of being the good one, the one who doesn't mess up, the one who always knows what to say. That character has saved you. It's protected you. It gave you belonging. But now, it's killing your soul. Because you don't just feel far from God, you feel far from yourself. Think about that for a moment. When was the last time you talked to God without trying to sound impressive? When was the last time you sat in His presence without needing to prove something? No goals, no spiritual checklist, just you, your real thoughts, your unfiltered emotion. If you're honest, maybe you don't even know who that person is anymore. But that's not because you've lost your faith. It's because you've lost touch with the you that existed before you learned that being lovable meant being perfect. And here's the truth that no one dared to tell you. God never loved the character. He was never impressed by the script. He never asked for the role you were playing. All the applause, the admiration, the sermons, the Bible studies, the image, they were never the requirement. They were the costume. And now the costume doesn't fit. It's tight, it's itchy, it's heavy, and it's tearing at the seams. But you keep wearing it because you're afraid. Afraid that if you stop being the one with strong faith, you'll be left behind. That people won't know what to do with the version of you who doubts, who breaks, who cries, who's tired. You're afraid that if you stop performing, you'll lose everything you gained through performance. And you might. You might lose the approval of people who only loved the character. You might lose the position, the platform, the praise. But in that loss, there's a freedom waiting for you that no role can offer. Because God isn't interested in your performance. He's interested in your permission. Permission to meet you where you are, not where you pretend to be. Permission to love the parts of you that are still confused, still healing, still in process. Permission to strip away the mask, not so He can shame you, but so he can finally show you who you are beneath it. But you can't receive that love as long as you're performing. You'll hear the words, but they'll bounce off the character's armor. You'll sit in church, and the message will feel hollow. You'll pray, and the words will echo back at you. Not because God is far, but because your soul is buried under the version of you that's too scared to be seen without makeup. And so the pain grows, quietly, invisibly, until one day, it's too much. You break down in private, or maybe you isolate, or maybe you just go numb, and you tell yourself you're backsliding. But what's really happening is that your soul is rejecting the lie, not the faith, the lie, the performance, the weight of pretending to be spiritually whole when you're emotionally falling apart. There's a voice inside you that still wants God, but it's tired of going through the character to get to Him. It wants to be seen directly, not filtered through a script. And that voice is sacred because it's real. What if the most holy thing you can do right now is stop pretending? What if taking off the costume is the first step to real intimacy? What if your crisis of faith is actually your soul trying to breathe? You've been applauded for your strength, but maybe it's time to be healed in your weakness. And maybe, just maybe, that healing won't begin until you allow the applause to stop. You were never supposed to become a product of people's need. But somewhere along the way, being needed started to feel like love, like purpose, like proof that you mattered. And so you gave your time, your energy, your prayers, your encouragement. You were the first one to answer the late-night messages, the one who always said yes, the one who carried everyone else's faith when their hands got tired. But as you kept showing up for everyone else, you started to disappear from yourself. There's a haunting silence that comes when the crowd leaves, and all you're left with is your own reflection. And you can't recognize the person staring back, because that person isn't just exhausted. They're empty, not because they don't believe anymore, but because their faith became a service, a duty, a checklist, a performance. And the audience never noticed the cost. You became the strong one because you had to, because it was safer than falling apart, because people expect strength from you, and you didn't want to disappoint them. But that strength came at a price, the slow erosion of your own identity. It's strange, isn't it, how spiritual language can become a disguise, how "I'm blessed" can cover up deep sadness, how "God is good" can silence unspoken pain. You start using the right words so much that they lose meaning. They become armor, and no one realizes you're bleeding underneath. The most dangerous kind of loneliness is the one that happens while you're surrounded by people, when you're praised but not understood, when everyone sees your light but no one asks about your shadow. You become known for the role you play, not the person you are, and that's how your soul starts to fracture. Freud said that when the true self is denied, it doesn't disappear, it retreats, it hides, it waits for safety. But if safety never comes, the self becomes buried beneath layers of performance, expectations, and defense mechanisms. You end up living as a version of yourself that's curated for acceptance. But it's not real acceptance, it's conditional approval. And your spirit can feel the difference. That's why the prayers feel distant. That's why the worship doesn't touch you the way it used to. It's not because you've grown cold. It's because the version of you doing all these things isn't fully present. It's a role, a protective shell, a mask you had to create to be accepted. And now, even God feels far. Not because He moved, but because you're not showing Him the real you anymore. Think about it. When was the last time you let yourself cry in prayer? Not because it looked spiritual, but because it was honest. When was the last time you told God the ugly truth? The parts of you that don't make sense, that feel contradictory, that don't have resolution. When was the last time your spiritual life was messy and human and raw, instead of polished and presentable? We've been taught that being used by God is the highest goal. But what if being seen by God is even more important? What if healing doesn't come through activity, but through authenticity? Somewhere inside you is a younger version of yourself, the one who just wanted to be loved without having to earn it. The one who wasn't the prayer warrior, or the leader, or the strong one, just you. That version of you didn't need to be needed. They just wanted to be known. And maybe that's the ache you've been feeling lately. Maybe that's the quiet grief that lingers even when everything looks fine. Maybe your spirit is grieving the disconnection, not from others, not even from God, but from yourself. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. You don't need to be wise to be safe. You don't need to have it all together to be held. But when you build your identity on what you do, instead of who you are, you teach your nervous system that love must be earned, that safety must be worked for, that presence must be justified. And so your faith becomes performance, not connection, not intimacy, just performance. And it's slowly draining you. That's why it's hard to rest. That's why silence feels unsafe. That's why solitude feels like punishment instead of peace. Because in the quiet, you start to hear your own heart, and what it's saying terrifies you. It's saying, I'm tired of being invisible. But here's the sacred truth. God doesn't want the version of you that pleases everyone. He wants the version that needs, not the one who performs for applause, the one who collapses into his presence, finally free to be unfiltered, unedited, and unashamed. There's a healing that comes not when you do more, but when you finally do less. When you lay down the need to be the one everyone counts on. When you let go of the pressure to inspire. When you choose to be honest instead of impressive. That's when real restoration begins. And no, not everyone will understand it. Some will miss the version of you that always said yes. Some will call it selfishness. Some will call it weakness. But your soul will call it truth. And God will call it worship. Because worship isn't just songs or scriptures or spiritual acts. Worship is choosing truth over image, choosing presence over performance, choosing to be known, even when it's uncomfortable. And if you're brave enough to stop being who you're not, you might finally rediscover who you really are. Sometimes the verses you cling to feel heavier than your burden, not because they're wrong, but because you've been using them to hold yourself together. Instead of letting them hold you, you repeat them like mantras. I can do all things. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. Be strong and courageous. But something inside you whispers, I don't feel strong. I don't feel courageous. I feel tired. Not just physically tired, soul tired. The kind of tired that no nap or vacation can fix. The kind of tired that comes from carrying your own pain in silence while quoting scriptures loud enough to convince everyone, including yourself, that you're okay. And it's not that you don't believe. You do. You believe in God's power. You believe in His promises. But somewhere along the way, faith stopped being a place you went to rest and became the place you went to pretend, to hide, to armor up. Armor is necessary in battle. But what happens when you forget to take it off? What happens when the helmet of salvation becomes a disguise instead of a covering? When the shield of faith is no longer protection, but a barrier between you and the comfort you desperately need? You don't cry anymore when you pray. Not because you've grown stronger, but because your emotions don't feel safe in God's presence. Somewhere, maybe long ago, someone told you that tears meant weakness. That feeling overwhelmed meant lack of faith. That doubting was sin. And so, you internalized it until your own humanity became the thing you felt most ashamed of. But God never asked you to be a robot of righteousness. He created you with emotion, not in spite of them, but through them. Even Jesus, the Son of God, wept. He was moved with compassion. He felt anguish. He groaned in spirit. If the embodiment of divine love made space for grief and sorrow, why are you trying to suppress yours in the name of spiritual maturity? Freud once said that unexpressed emotions never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. And maybe that's why your faith feels so fragile, because what you thought was faith was really suppression dressed up in spiritual vocabulary. You've been told to speak life, so you never admit that something inside feels like it's dying. You've been taught to declare victory, so you never confess when you're losing battles no one sees. You've been trained to smile during worship, even when your heart is breaking. And somewhere, Scripture stopped being a source of connection and became a script you performed. Let's be honest. Sometimes reading the Bible feels like reading a script you're no longer part of. You know the verses, you've heard the sermons, you've memorized the truth, but none of it seems to touch you. Not because the words change, but because you haven't been allowed to show up fully. The Word of God can only heal what you're willing to reveal, and that's where the shift must begin. Not in what you read, but in how you read it. What if Scripture wasn't meant to be ammunition for your defense, but a blanket for your grief? What if the Psalms weren't just declarations of praise, but honest journals of pain, confusion, anger, and longing? David wasn't afraid to say, "Why, O Lord, do you hide your face from me?" He wasn't ashamed to admit, "My soul is in deep anguish." He didn't cover it up with cheerful theology. He brought it into the presence of God, raw, unfiltered, trembling. And that, too, was worship. But for some of us, worship has become performance. We lift our hands, not because we're surrendered, but because it's expected. We repeat phrases, not because they're true to us in the moment, but because they're familiar. We play roles, even in our quiet time. And then we wonder why our souls feel untouched. It's not that your faith is broken, it's that it's been twisted into a coping mechanism. You've been using it to survive instead of allowing it to help you feel, to actually grieve, to actually mourn what you lost, to actually name what hurts. Because yes, there are things you've lost that you never let yourself grieve. Not just people, but parts of yourself, moments, dreams, confidence, childhood innocence, seasons where you felt close to God, to others, to your own soul. And instead of processing that grief, you just kept pushing forward, kept quoting, kept serving, kept performing. But nothing grows in a place that's never allowed to mourn. Even Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." That means comfort isn't given to those who deny their pain. It's given to those who face it, feel it, sit with it, not alone, but in sacred honesty, before the God who weeps with them. Maybe your faith isn't weak. Maybe it's just tired of being your mask. Maybe it's aching to become your safe space again. Maybe it's time to stop dressing your wounds with verses and start letting those verses become windows through which the light can finally enter. The light doesn't shame you for bleeding. It invites you to stop hiding. And if you let it, healing will begin. You weren't born pretending. Somewhere along the way, you learned it. You learned that if you wanted to be safe, you had to be strong. That if you wanted to be loved, you had to be inspiring. That if you wanted to be accepted, you had to be unbreakable. So you put on the smile. You stood firm in your declarations. You quoted the verses. And for a while, it worked. People clapped. They called you mature. They leaned on your strength. But deep down, you knew something wasn't right. You weren't healing. You were performing. And performances are exhausting. What no one tells you is that even spiritual strength can become a prison if it's never allowed to rest. Even faith can feel like a burden when it's always used as armor. There's a difference between believing in God and using belief to keep God at a distance. One invites intimacy, the other builds walls. You didn't mean to do it. You were just trying to cope. But somewhere along the line, faith became less about connection and more about containment. Less about surrender, more about self-control. Less about grace, more about grit. And so you began measuring your spiritual health by how well you could hold it together, rather than how deeply you could let go. But here's the truth. Most churches won't say out loud. Sometimes, the people who look the strongest spiritual are the most emotionally starved. They give the most. They serve the most. They pray the loudest, but they go home empty, and they blame themselves for it. If that's you, I want you to hear this. Your emptiness is not a spiritual failure. It's an invitation to rediscover a version of faith that makes room for you, all of you. Not just the parts that testify, but the parts that tremble. Not just the bold declarations, but the quiet breakdowns behind closed doors. Not just the "I'm blessed and highly favored" responses, but the "I don't even know what I feel anymore" confessions that never make it into public prayer. Because if faith is only allowed in polished form, it stops being real. And if you've started to feel disconnected from your own belief, maybe it's not because you're drifting from God. Maybe it's because you've been drifting from yourself. The self you silent, the self you buried, the self that still feels too messy, too angry, too confused to bring into a holy place. But God isn't afraid of that version. He's been waiting for it. It's the you that shows up when everyone else leaves, the you that cries without knowing why, the you that's tired of being the strong one. That version doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be heard. And maybe you're realizing that all this time, your faith has been trying to do the work of your emotions. You tried to faith away your sadness. You tried to rebuke your anxiety. You thought if you fasted enough, prayed enough, volunteered enough, the ache would go away. But the ache isn't sin. It's signal. It's pointing to the fact that you need more than willpower. You need space. Safe space. Emotional space. Sacred space. Space to feel what you've been avoiding. To stop pretending you're okay when you're not. To name what's real without fearing rejection or correction. The problem is, most religious environments aren't designed for that. They celebrate the victorious testimony, not the vulnerable journey. They elevate those who look unshakable, not those who dare to fall apart. And in those spaces, your heart learned to survive, but not to heal. So you did what many do. You hid behind scriptures. You made your pain sound poetic. You mastered the language of the overcomer. But inside, you were breaking, not from lack of faith, but from the loneliness of never being fully seen. Let me say it plainly. Being tired of pretending is not rebellion. It's revelation. It means your soul is waking up. It means the mask is cracking. It means you're ready for more, not more effort, but more truth. And truth can't live where performance still reigns. You might be wondering what that even looks like. What does it mean to be real with God? It means talking to Him when you're angry, when you're bitter, when you don't understand. It means laying your heart bare, not just your theology. It means letting God into the parts of you that don't have the right words yet, just tears, silence, or confusion. That's the beginning of intimacy. And that's the kind of faith that restores rather than exhausts. Because there is a kind of faith that breathes, that listens, that doesn't just speak life into your situation. It listens to the life that's already inside you, buried under layers of defense mechanisms and emotional armor. That kind of faith doesn't push you to fake it until you make it. It whispers, you don't have to fake anything, just come as you are. So if your soul is tired, maybe it's not your belief that's the problem. Maybe it's the pressure you've put on yourself to always be okay, to always be the one with answer, to always be the example. Maybe it's time to let go of that expectation and return to the simple truth that you're loved, even when you're not strong, especially when you're not strong. Because grace isn't just for the lost, it's for the found who are falling apart quiet. And when you remember that, healing begins to whisper its way in. You've spent so long being who you thought you had to be, you forgot how to just be. Somewhere between the verses you memorized and the prayers you performed, the real you got quieter, soft, almost invisible, and yet still aching to be known. Maybe you've built a whole life around faith, but deep down, you wonder if anyone would recognize you without the spiritual armor. You're the one people look to for answers, encouragement, strength. But what if the only reason you keep putting the armor on is because you're afraid of what will happen the day you take it off? It's a terrifying thought, because when you've made faith your identity, how do you admit that you're tired of pretending? How do you confess that your prayers feel hollow, your worship feels forced, and your heart, once full of wonder, now feels like it's surviving on autopilot? You don't even remember the last time you felt God, instead of just talking about Him. This is where many people secretly live, in the shadows between image and essence, between the testimony they give and the truth they're afraid to tell. They're not walking away from God. They're just trying to find the pieces of themselves that got lost while trying to be the perfect believer. But here's the radical truth most of us were never taught. God never needed your perfection. He wanted your presence, not your polished mask, not your filtered responses, not your rehearsed declarations of faith when your soul is screaming for breath. He wanted you, the whole you, even the broken parts, especially the broken parts. You've confused strength with silence, But silence doesn't mean stability. And stuffing your emotions into spiritual language doesn't make them go away. It just buries them deeper, until one day they start speaking through your body, your anxiety, your fatigue, your lack of joy. That's not rebellion. That's your soul waving a white flag. You were never meant to carry your healing alone. That's not what faith is for. Faith was never supposed to be your mask. It was supposed to be your map, a guide back home, not to the person people expect you to be, but to the one God designed before the world convinced you to perform. You're not weak because you want to rest. You're not broken because you're weary. You're human, and God honors the human. He breathed into dust, remember? He called the fragile very good. And He's not asking you to be superhuman. He's asking you to be honest. And honesty is where transformation begins. Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to stop defending your emotions with theology, to stop feeling guilty for your sadness, to sit in the presence of God, not as His representative, but as His child. What if the most spiritual thing you could do today was cry? What if surrender looked less like shouting in victory and more like whispering, "I'm tired"? What if that's the moment heaven leans in closest? Because maybe your soul isn't malfunctioning, maybe it's maturing, maybe it's refusing to be a puppet of performance any longer. Maybe it's calling you deeper, into a kind of faith that doesn't require makeup, masks, or mantra. A kind of faith where God isn't just your fortress. He's your friend, your father, the safe place you can finally exhale, where you can admit that you don't have the answers, where you can stop trying to earn what was never meant to be earned, where you can discover that grace doesn't run out when your strength does. It begins there, and in that place, something sacred happens. Not the loud revival, not the electrifying breakthrough, but the quiet repair of your inner world. A restoration that doesn't need to prove itself, a peace that doesn't perform, a healing that holds you. Even when you're not holding it together, you'll start to notice the shift in small ways. You'll breathe deeper. You'll stop needing to explain yourself all the time. You'll stop clinging to roles you've outgrown. You'll begin to enjoy silence instead of fearing it. And you'll learn to pray not as a warrior trying to win a battle, but as a beloved child crawling back into the lap of love. This is where faith becomes light again. Not because life gets easier, but because you're no longer carrying it alone. Not because you've mastered the script, but because you've given yourself permission to tear it up and speak from your soul instead. You were never called to be a spiritual actor. You were called to be a living story of redemption. And stories, real ones, have pain, process, and transformation. Not just declarations, but confessions. Not just altars, but ashes. Not just light, but shadow. So if you're tired, that's okay. If you're doubting, that's okay. If you're not sure what you believe anymore, that's okay. Because that doesn't mean you've lost your faith. It means you're shedding the performance. It means the mask is breaking. And beneath it, God is still there, patient, present, unmoved by your confusion, ready to walk with you, not just when you're holy, but when you're honest. So let the armor fall, let the tears come, let the silence speak, let the real you rise, and let your faith finally become a place of rest, not resistance.